Are you looking for an inspiring listen? Something to motivate you? You've come to the right place. Welcome to Women of the Northwest, where we have conversations with ordinary women leading extraordinary lives. Motivating, inspiring, compelling. Hello, friends, and welcome. Today's interview is with Julie McDonald Zander. She is an avid fan of history, earned a bachelor's degree in communications and political sciences from the University of Washington. After working 2 decades as a newspaper reporter and editor, she launched a personal history business to capture and preserve life stories. Her company, Chapters of Life, has published more than 75 books. She and her husband live in the Pacific Northwest, where they raise 2 children. She has a nonfiction book about Matilda Kuntz Jackson called Washington Territory's Grand Lady, The Story of Matilda. It was a finalist for the Western Writers of American Spur Award and the Will Rogers Medallion. Anyway, let's just dig right in and hear her story. Welcome, everybody, to Women of the Northwest. My guest today is Julie McDonald Zander. Thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you for having me.
We got to chat together the other day at a writing table in an event, and so sharing a table together and getting to know each other and looking at your books and all that kind of fun stuff. You got some interesting stories going on there.
Well, it was fun hearing your stories too about your memoir and your romance writing.
Yeah. So you're a journalist. You write a little bit. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I graduated in communications and political science from University of Washington and started working in newspapers. And I worked for a weekly, and then I worked for a couple dailies. After 10 years as a reporter, I moved up to the city desk and became an assistant city editor. I did that for about 10 years. And then I quit to launch my personal history business. So I used to edit the obituaries for the newspaper. And as I would edit them, I'd think, oh, this person has a great story. But they are gone and they took their stories with them. So I decided to catch people before they die and capture those stories, so, at least for their family and friends.
Isn't that interesting how, life leads you into one thing or another and you kind of go, there's an idea,
Yeah. I had done that for my own, my mom and my dad, just because I wanted to, get that link with my grandparents that I never knew and things like that. So I had done it with my family. And then my mom encouraged me to do it as a business. I thought, nobody's going to want to do this. But, I started Chapters of Life in 1999 and I've been doing it ever since.
So how does that work? Tell us about that.
I will, when I meet clients, I will show them my books now, but I interview people in their own homes and we do it for a life story book. It's usually 10 to 12 hours of interview over a period of time, usually about 2 hours each time. And then I will transcribe those interviews and edit them into a narrative, and then I give that to the client to review. And meanwhile, I'll scan their photos and memorabilia to put into a book, and then we compile it all together into a book and publish it. Usually it's small runs for family and friends, and that can be hardbound, it can be paperback. I've worked with a small printer up in Centralia, Forum Printing, and they've been terrific. And their minimum print run is 25 copies. But most of my clients do between 50 and 200 copies. So
Yeah. Oh, that sounds really interesting. That'd be fun. Well, I think I told you too that I've had a couple of interviews with 100-year-old women, that just to be able to preserve their story for their families and friends, and hear their voice again too.
Yep. I've done a lot of them. In 2007, I started writing a column for the Chronicle up in Centralia. And I do a lot of history because I'm very interested in history, but I've done a lot of seniors and elderly people because they're living history. They have seen so many changes in their lives, and I just love to capture that for family and friends and also for the readers of the Chronicle. So I always learn something from everybody I interview.
Yeah, that's really cool. How many of those life stories have you done? Have you
Well,
published?
altogether, I've done over 75 books, but some of those are most of those are individual life stories. Some of those were bigger projects like company histories. I did a history of Centralia College. I've done a history of Bucota, and that was 2 books that became a project that turned into 2 books. And I did a history of our Lewis County Courthouse, which was a historic courthouse. I've done church histories, school histories. So and an industrial park history. So it kind of depends on what the client wants. Some of the bigger ones, I will interview more people, up to 20 people, 30 people, and gather their interviews or their stories and compile it into a narrative. So it's always fun, and it feels good to know that history's been captured. I mean, one of the hazards of my job is interviewing people in their 80s and 90s is that a lot of them they're gone, but it's really nice to know they left their stories behind.
The legacy, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It is a legacy. I did in our community, we honored the Rosie the Riveters back in 2005. And
Yeah.
we had like 80 people respond. And we started with a little booklet that ended up with a big book. But we have a chapter there on where were you when Pearl Harbor happened. And then there was a local family that was interned, a Japanese American family that was interned. So there's a chapter on the Japanese internment. And then Boeing started a lot of branch plants throughout the Northwest here. They had Chehalis. They established a branch plant in Chehalis to build B-17 wings for the B-17 bombers. And so a lot of the women in our community worked there at the Boeing plant. And then, of course, like the Kaiser shipyards, then a lot of these people who had worked in the defense industries shared their stories with us. And one of our Rosies, the only one locally who I know of that's in the book that is still alive, she was 16 when she started working at the Mount Rainier Ordnance Depot. And she had long red fingernails. And one of the guys she worked with, he knew her dad, and he told her to go home and play with dolls. That's what he told her. But she was 16, and she ended up being really fast and efficient with putting together Jeep axles. She won the efficiency award from they gave the general, bestowed one on her. And then, so she came back, and this guy thought she had gotten fired, and he told her that, oh, I thought they fired you. And she had a rose. They gave her a rose, and she put it in her mouth and said, nope, nope. She got honored instead. So she's a wonderful, wonderful lady. And I had a book signing just this month, November 9th in Chehalis at the Lewis County Museum. And Doris was there and signed the Life on the Homefront book, because there's a chapter in there about that. Go home and play with dolls, So she's one of our last Rosie the Riveters. But the nice thing is all of those 80 people, part of their stories is preserved in that book, Life on the Homefront. And it's just reassuring, I guess. They've left a part of themselves behind, a part of their role in history has been chronicled for future generations. So, and the same with the World War II veterans I've interviewed and put into a book too. So that's nice.
How did you contact these riveters, your Rosies? How do you contact them and get hold of them?
Well, I have a friend she was a county commissioner for 2 terms, but she knows everybody in the community. She's one of those people. And when I was on the committee with her, the list, she would find out about people's names, and the list started smaller and it grew. And I put together a little booklet with photos and stuff, and I asked people questions in there. And I think we sent out about 50 of those initially. We ended up with about 80 Rosie the Riveters, in the book, mentioned in the book. But I was surprised at the response rate. People were really eager to share their stories,
Yeah.
And I guess, and one lady, when I handed her the copy of the book, she said, well, should have done it a long time ago. I'm thinking, yeah, probably, but we did it now. So
That had to have been fascinating. Just fun stories and yeah. Yeah.
And they were amazing. They were our grand marshals for the parade in 2005, the Rosie the Riveters. And we call them Rosie and the guys because there were some guys on the home front too who, weren't, they didn't go to the military for some reason, or they couldn't get in, or they were on farms and stuff. And they also worked in the defense industries. So Rosie and the guys, they were our grand marshals that year.
Wow, that's cool. When you write your historical books, are they mostly Northwest things or are they located other places?
Yeah, they've mostly been Northwest historical things, and I've done a lot of historical columns for the newspaper that are about local history. And for some reason, I just history's kind of fascinated me. And like the my debut novel that just came out, I had seen a little plaque at the museum, just a little tiny plaque, and it said that this woman had suffered tragedy on the Oregon Trail. And I went, wow, what would you do? You're so far away from your family. So I spent 5 years digging into that in my spare time between personal history projects. And I went to the Washington State Library and dug into a couple boxes they had of the family papers and things like that. And I wrote the nonfiction book of what did this woman do, And then, but nonfiction has a different audience than fiction. And so fiction reaches more people. And then I had debated about whether or not to write it as fiction or nonfiction. And I took it to a critique group and they said, well, you need dialogue. And I thought, wait, this woman died in 1901. If I put words in her mouth, it's no longer nonfiction. So I actually published it as nonfiction, Washington Territory's Grand Lady. And that was because her story had never been told. I mean, a lot of the history in the Northwest and everywhere, I think, is about the men. And so I do believe behind every good man, there's a woman. And, he could not have done all the things he did if she hadn't been home there running the hotel, cooking all the meals for the guests that came, taking care of everything. So, and her story to me, it was just fascinating. So I published that as a nonfiction, but then I had joined two writers' critique groups, and to learn how to write fiction. And I had never written fiction, but it intrigued me. And I actually go 200 miles round trip once a month down to Sherwood, Oregon for a writer's critique group because Melanie Dobson had an opening in her group. And I said, oh, sign me up, sign me up. So I've been doing that and I have learned so much. And from Melanie and Nicole and Dawn Shipman was in there. She was there Saturday, and Tracy Heska. And it's been a wonderful group and I have learned so much. And they're so nice about the way they tell me the same thing as a secular group told me. The secular group wasn't so nice about it, but they would say the same thing. So instead they will say, well, instead of saying this stinks, they'll say, you don't really need to put in the story about everything they packed into the wagons. So, get the reporter out of there. So,
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they've been very patient.
Yeah, that is tricky. There's a lot of little things about it, but wow, what a beautiful thing to do it with some well-known people and really their advice has got to be wonderful.
Oh, it is. I go to that one once a month, and then I have one in Centralia I go to once a week. And it's another Christian writers critique group. But Debbie Lee writes romance, and I'm terrible with romance. So I was like, Debbie, help me. And I have Kyle Pratt in there. He writes sci-fi fantasy, post-apocalyptic things. So Joyce Scott, we have I think we have like 6 or 8 now in there. And it's been Barbara Tiff Blakey writes some historical fiction. And then Heather Alexander has a book that's almost like the Mitford series. In a lot of ways, I keep saying it's like the Mitford series just because it's one of those with the characters are so cool. You just really want to keep reading. So I love my critique groups. I have learned so much from all of them, the members in there.
I joined Encore through the college and they have a writing critique group there where it's on Zoom all the time. But and there's 8 or 10 of us that show up. Some of them are poets and others are once writing a kind of a futuristic type of book, and another historical. She has her family came on the wagon train and doing her stories there or whatever. But they are so their critiques are so great. I mean, real specific kind of things. Well, even down to a word or down to something. And I haven't had that before, so I really, really appreciate it.
Yep. I do that too. I just love that. I went to one years ago and it was everybody just said, "Oh, this is nice." Well, that wasn't worth my time.
Yeah,
So it's like I read it at my critique group up there. Okay, guys, let me have it. Let me have it. How can I make this better?
yeah,
And it's been so wonderful. So I really credit the last 5 years for for my novel, the nurturing that I've gotten from both critique groups to help me learn how to write fiction,
yeah.
point of view, all these things I never knew as a nonfiction
Right.
writer.
No head hopping. No.
Yeah, head hopping, point of view, and the deep point of view, and it's great. Everybody brings something different to all the
No
critique.
info dumps.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's been wonderful. And then also quite a few of my critique group members were beta readers for my novel because they see it every week, a little bit.
Yeah.
And then they read the whole thing and they gave me terrific ways to improve it. And I owe a lot to them. I credited them all in the back of the book because
Yeah.
they're
Yeah. Yeah. Because it made such a difference. Yeah. That's amazing. What's one of your favorite books that you've written?
that I've written.
Yeah.
Well, of course, my debut novel now, and in my column I've written about. Everybody knows who's read my columns that she's my favorite pioneer. We have a
And
lot of
tell
great
us the name
pioneers.
again. Tell us the name of
The debut novel is called The Reluctant Pioneer,
it. Okay.
and it's about Matilda Kuntz Jackson. And she ended up when she did make it out here, she was living in what became the first courthouse in Washington Territory. And it's still standing because her granddaughter helped spearhead a women's group to preserve that. So it was falling down, and the women's group, the St. Helens Club, raised money to preserve that historic courthouse, which is now part of the State Parks Department. And then her daughter actually donated 5 acres to the state parks and they created a state park in Matilda Jackson's name. So it's Matilda Jackson State Park. It's the second, I think it was the second park in the state of Washington. So anyway, Matilda, she entertained Ulysses Grant and Generals Sheridan and I think who else? Anyway, Washington Territorial Governor Isaac Stevens. When I went through all these journals, there were people that left comments about it. And she was also I wasn't sure when I dug into this whether she was a Christian or had any faith at all, but I don't know how you could have survived what she did without faith. But anyway, I did find a little note in the historical museum that said that in 1853 they shipped a bunch of stuff to the Jacksons around Cape Horn. And among those were a hymnal and a Bible and all these things. I thought, yeah. And then later on, as I dug into it more, a lot of the newspaper articles that quoted her grandchildren said that, well, grandma was sad today, but they described how she always had her Bible on her lap.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, so she's like, I've always kind of looked at her as one of the sweet, gentle, kind people, and she was a great housekeeper and she was a great cook and all the things that I'm not. I guess that may be why I admire her so much.
She's a hero.
Yeah. Yeah, she is.
I don't know. Can anybody be great at all those things?
I know. I said that I have to give her a flaw when I was in my critique group.
Yeah.
I think she was pretty amazing myself.
Still got to have a pain point in there.
Yep. You can't be imperfect, so.
And is that the one you got the award of?
That the nonfiction, I was a finalist for Western Writers of America and the Will Rogers Medallion. So
Yeah.
and then that's why. And then 5 years later, now I've come out with the fictional account, and it was so fun to write the fictional version. The the other one was good, but you have to stick to the facts in the nonfiction. So
Back
when
him.
yeah, just the facts. And with the fictional version, I was able to get into kind of into her head along the Oregon Trail, and when things happened, and when she shot down Celilo Falls, I could get in that canoe with her and go, oh my gosh. So it was fun I think it's more fun to read it, and it was also more fun to write it.
Yeah. And did you have a little bit of imposter syndrome when you were writing the dialogue to begin with
On the
on the
fiction,
fiction?
no, I would have, except for I had already told her story.
Uh-huh.
And I am so glad that her story, the nonfiction story, is told, because it freed me up
Uh-huh.
to do that. Otherwise, I would have, because I didn't feel right putting words in her mouth. But having told her story in the nonfiction book, it gave me some freedom to go ahead and tell the story as a novel and stuff. Because if anybody really wants the real story, they can go look at the other book.
Yeah. 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 That was one of the things that was hard when I wrote my memoir, was trying to figure out, because you know the essence of what happened, but the actual conversations, I mean, 30 years ago, it's kind of like, so could I make that up, or could I could make it up finally. I had to be okay with just doing it that way, because otherwise, who wants to read a memoir that's dry and
Oh, that's right. And with
I mean,
memoir,
dialogue gives it life.
right. And with the memoir, you were there.
I was
So
there, but I still had to make up conversations because,
right, but you can
yeah.
kind of remember the essence of what happened, if not the exact words. So when I help people write their memoirs, and I tell them, they'll tell me, "Oh, he said this or that," and that's the best of the recollection. Who else is going to be there around to dispute it? You
Mhm.
know, so you do the best you can to piece it together.
Yeah.
I really love the idea that with your memoir, that you had your son involved in doing that audiobook. I mean,
Yeah.
you gave me shivers when you let me listen to that. I mean, that's pretty amazing. You've been like Matilda, you've been through some things. You really have. So
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
we
That's
can all learn from people who survive tragedies.
yeah. Yeah. And I think that's the reason why you do those things. It's not just about, oh, I had this horrible life and this is what happened, but it's about what happened because it and through, and how it remakes you, and the things you
How your faith, a lot of times your faith,
yeah.
you go through those things and your faith will carry you through that. And you don't see that till afterwards,
Yeah.
that God carried you through a lot of those things,
Yeah.
and you don't even notice that. But when after you've gone through it, you can look back and reflect and go, boy, my questioning this or that really deepened my faith.
Yeah. Yeah.
I went through infertility and read all these books about, when God doesn't make sense, and disappointment with God and things like that. Because, I mean, I was jealous of the dairy cows across the street. I'd say, God, you let them get pregnant. Why won't you let me get pregnant? We had a lot of these conversations.
You know
But
what? That's one of those things that when you get to heaven, it's like, that does not make sense. Why does somebody, or why does somebody who wants miscarriages, or just, I don't know, there's so many, the whole fertility thing, or
yeah,
how
yeah,
that
when
works
people,
is,
yeah, there are people that really would long to have children, and then there are people aborting children because they don't want them, and it's just, I'm trying to figure out God, but that's way beyond my, my job description.
yeah, yeah. It's just, there's some things that are mysteries, and it's just, but they're painful, there's a
Uh-huh.
lot of pain in there. And that's another, have you ever written about that?
I've written columns about it, and it's funny. You write your column and you throw it out there into the world, and you don't wonder sometimes if anybody even reads it. But once in a while, you'll get some feedback. And when I wrote about the infertility, my struggle with infertility, I received an email from a woman who said, "You don't know how much I needed that today." And to me, that made the whole writing your column worthwhile,
Yeah. Yeah.
because if God touched one person through what I wrote, that's the whole point.
Yeah.
It doesn't every week. Some weeks it's like every week you have
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
come up
Yeah.
with something. It's like, it's not going to hit it every week, and I've made people mad with some of them too. Don't get into politics, boy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a danger in that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a little dangerous. But one of the other columnists had told me, to kind of avoid politics and religion. And I should have taken his advice on the politics, but I said, God is part of my life. If I'm writing about my life, I'm not going to be able to avoid him, so that, and I had one of the biggest compliments I had was from a woman. I had worked with her husband when I worked at the Chronicle back in the 80s. But anyway, I saw her at a 90th birthday party for a woman, and she came up to me and she grabbed both my hands and she said, I just want to thank you for putting God back in the newspaper.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought, you know what? I mean, I wasn't preaching or anything, but
Yeah.
he's
That
part of my life, so I'm going to write about it, and that
exactly.
was to me an awesome compliment. That
Yeah.
was just like, wow, it was pretty neat. She ended up being 102 when she passed away. She was pretty amazing. I went and interviewed her when she had her 100th birthday. She got on the treadmill. She got on a rowing machine. I mean, she was just amazing. She was from Sweden. I try to write the narrative and retain the narrator's voice so that people, it sounds like the person's voice when people read the story. At a funeral for one of the guys a man whose book I wrote, this guy got up, he was a former mayor, and he said, this just sounds like Ed. And I thought, you know what? That's what I don't want it to sound like me. I want it to sound like Ed. And when he said that, I just thought that's mission accomplished,
Yeah, interesting. What tell us about a couple others. We've only got a few minutes left here, but tell us a couple of other gists of your books.
I've interviewed a lot of World War II veterans. Most of those are gone now too, and those were fascinating stories. I actually helped the Veterans Memorial Museum up in Chehalis. If you've ever gone along I-5 north towards Seattle, it's at exit 77. And when I first heard how that museum got started, it just it was like your memoir. It gave me shivers because this man, was interviewing veterans for a church thing or something. And one of the World War II veterans came up to him and had tears in his eyes and said, I thought everybody had forgotten, And so then at 3 a.m, he felt like God woke him up and spoke to him and it said, don't let them be forgotten. And so he waited until his wife woke up and he said, what am I supposed to do with that? So then he went out, and this was back in the 90s. He went out and bought a video camera and he started recording. He was a carpenter, but he started recording people's stories, and they would give him all these memorabilia and uniforms and things. And eventually he and his wife, talk about stepping out in faith, they mortgaged their house to build a museum to store all that stuff. And this is why when I heard that story, I was just amazed. And we published a book. I helped to publish this book called The Miracle Museum, because, they remodeled this space, and then all the people, veterans just swarmed to this, and they had enough money to actually build a nice museum, which is at exit 77. And I went upstairs, and it was one of those things where I really wanted to tell his story. And then it was funny because I was going to rent the upstairs for a meeting, and then he was talking, we were emailing back and forth, and he said, would you like to tell the story? I thought that was a God thing. So I couldn't afford, to pay a transcriptionist. So I'm upstairs typing away as he's telling me one story after another, and I'm getting tears in my eyes from all the healing that veterans experienced when they came in and saw things, So one story after another, and I'm sitting here trying to type and wipe my eyes at the same time. But that was just a volunteer project that felt God was involved in that. And, it's called the Miracle Museum. And to me, it's a pretty amazing story. And he and his wife were pretty amazing to start that museum, which is still thriving. He moved to North Dakota and stuff, but talk about a legacy. And on the side of the building, if you go to the museum, it says, they shall not be forgotten.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it doesn't glorify war. It honors the service of the men and women who were involved in that. And they have a wall of honor where little tiles can be purchased for family members. And I have my husband's, who was in Vietnam. I have my dad's, who was in Korea. I have 3 uncles and a great uncle that are all on the wall of honor there.
That is really special. I'll put a link in the show notes for how people can get hold of you, and especially if they're interested in having something done like that and just be able to find your books.
All right.
That will be awesome. And thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me. It was so fun.
That's all for today. Did you know it's easy to share an episode with your friends? When the podcast is open, look for 3 dots. Click on them and you'll see various options. You can download the episode, play it next or last, go to the show, save the episode, or copy the link. Isn't technology amazing? Hey, I'm looking forward to you joining me next time. I hope you have a great week.